This conference will now be recorded.
Welcome everyone to this on-demand FIDO webinar focused on the approach of using multiple authenticators to support account recovery in consumer-centric deployments. I'm very pleased today to have two expert speakers for today's session who also served as co-editors on corresponding white paper on this topic. Wataru Ogami of Yahoo Japan is going to be our lead speaker today. And then Max Hata of NTT Docomo will be joining as well for Q&A. I have some questions at the end of this that Max will lead response on following the initial presentation. And I'm Andrew Shikiar, Executive Director and Chief Marketing Officer at FIDO Alliance. I'm going to give some context to this topic before we jump into the presentation. So on that note, let's talk a little bit about FIDO and account recovery. Simply put, while FIDO authentication has proven to meet our tagline of simpler, stronger authentication, providing user-friendly and an unphishable alternative to passwords and traditional means of 2FA, account recovery has always been a challenge for FIDO. And those who are inside the FIDO landscape and inside the industry understand this challenge. This is largely because the nature of FIDO authentication is that it's possession-based, requiring a user to validate or verify their physical presence rather than depending on server-side shared secrets. This possession-based nature of FIDO is why it's immune to scalable attacks. But the big question has always been, what happens if I, or what happens if my customer loses their authenticator? If our only answer to that question is to tell service providers to re-enroll users through their traditional mechanisms, then we're potentially taking a step backwards, forcing users to answer KBA challenges or reestablishing passwords, both of which approaches are vulnerable to social engineering or credential stuffing. The good news is, two things. First, FIDO's addressing this challenge through our new initiative in identity verification and binding, but that work's not complete. So in the interim, it's important for FIDO to provide expert guidance on how to manage account recovery. Now, I'd note that we have other recordings and other resources on FIDO's work in identity verification that I'd encourage all of you to check out separate from today's webinar. But last year, we've been looking at this topic for a while. Last year, we issued an initial white paper with account recovery recommendations, including the suggestions to have users register multiple FIDO authenticators. And that's the topic that we're going to address today. In fact, this was followed up in more detail in the most recent white paper that came out earlier this summer by the same title, featuring today's guest speakers. So with that, I'm very pleased to turn things over to one of our guest speakers, starting with Ogami-san of Yahoo Japan.
Andrew, thank you for your introduction. And this is Wataru Ogami from Yahoo Japan Corporation. And now I will talk about our white paper titled Multiple Authenticators for Reducing Account Recovery Needs for FIDO-Enabled Consumer Accounts. The objective of this presentation is to introduce Multiple Authenticators white paper. My presentation consists of 3 parts. First, I will give you some background about multiple authenticators in FIDO. Secondly, I'm going to talk about use cases of registration to add an authenticator. Finally, we will move on to policy control for the registration. If you want more information about each of these, please go to the URL below. In this part of my presentation, I'd like to tell you about the need for multiple authenticators. The FIDO protocol provides users with simple and strong authentication. Authenticators indicate user-owned device for FIDO authentication. For example, users can only successfully authenticate if the combination of the registered reliant parties and the authenticator is correct. So there is no risk of passwords being stolen online or credentials being compromised by a corporate accident. Also, with device biometrics, there is no need to remember many different passwords for each services. However, if you lose your registered FIDO device, you may have no way to access your account. Or what should you do if you change your phone models? Especially for services that only use FIDO to eliminate passwords, adding an additional authenticator without a password is a solution for these cases. Our paper summarizes these contents. We will show you how to register an additional authenticator for users who have already registered at least one FIDO authenticator. We categorize several variants of additional authenticators to be added and discuss the recommended registration methods. We also provide examples of registration policies. In particular, we describe how to implement specific policy controls using WebAuthn. The main target of audience for this paper is developers from the reliant party, especially providing consumer services. However, these things are not within the scope of this paper. For example, enterprise use cases are assumed to be easier to control than consumer ones, but they are not dealt with in our paper. Even so, we believe that it is possible to implement a similar approach described in this paper for enterprise use cases. We also don't deal with how to verify your identity to add an additional authenticator. An identity verification method will put the users through a troublesome experience compared to the routine use of FIDO. This webinar and this paper will not cover this topic. And finally, relying parties which both passwords and FIDO are available won't have any trouble registering additional authenticator. So this paper does not show how to register with passwords. Now let's take a look at how to register an additional authenticator. Our challenge is not registration operations for the first FIDO authenticator. If you want to know these operations, please refer to FIDO web page. We consider a situation in which a user has already registered an authenticator and the user wants to register an additional authenticator. Our challenge is how to add another authenticator on that assumption. The most challenging issue for us is to register an additional authenticator without password authentication. With a registered authenticator, users can authenticate by using FIDO protocol. If an additional authenticator can be connected to the authenticated device, then secure registration based on FIDO is possible. The main point I'd like to make in this section is that additional registration shall be performed securely by connecting the authenticator to each other. Please refer to the CTAP2 specification on FIDO web page for more information on how the hardware will be connected to each other. The combination of device connections are shown in this table. Firstly, I will explain what these diagrams represent. These green circles indicated an authenticator. The number 1 in the circle indicates the registered authenticator, and the number 2 indicates the additional authenticator that you are about to add. The square indicates the device, and the authenticator inside of square is platform authenticator, and the circle connected outside is roaming authenticator. And this is a combination of multiple authenticators connected to one client device. For example, in case 1, you already registered your security key, and you will add fingerprint authenticator of your laptop. In both cases, additional authenticators can be registered in the same way. This sequence shows a flow on one client device use cases. In this sequence, the security key on the left side is the registered authenticator, and the PC in the middle is the additional authenticator. First, the user accessing a relying party's website. The relying party will then perform FIDO authentication with the registered security key. The user authenticates with an already registered authenticator and then registers another authenticator connected to the same device. This method takes over the session. Additional registration can be done only with the FIDO protocol, which is secure. On the other hand, the case that the platform authenticators are connected to each other is little complicated. For example, if you want to add your new smartphone with your old one. In the case of 2 devices, there are 3 methods to add. The first is very simple, connecting device directly with CTAP2. In this case, the smartphone connected with BLE looks like a roaming authenticator, so you can register as securely as in one client device use cases. Second, use another roaming authenticator to register. For example, desktop PCs may not be able to connect to each other directly. As shown in this figure, the security key can be connected to both PCs using USB. First, register the security key using the registered authenticator on the left-hand side. Next, reconnect the security key to PC on the right-hand side. Then, you can register as securely as in one client device use cases. This method is also secure because depending on FIDO protocol. The third method is to use out-of-band. After authenticating with the registered authenticator, as shown in the figure, something like a QR code is displayed on the registered device. Additional registration is possible by scanning the QR code with a smartphone's camera. However, the out-of-band is not secure because it does not depend on FIDO protocol. There is risk of man-in-the-middle attack. So it is important for relying parties developers to use these out-of-band methods carefully according to their security requirements. This is a summary of registration methods. We recommended a registration method based on the one client device use cases. The out-of-band method for the 2 client device use cases requires careful implementation to prevent token theft or phishing attacks. Finally, I will talk about policy control. This figure shows the registration flow in the FIDO protocol. 3 actions are important to control the policy. The first point is preliminary information. In this point, relying parties can confirm whether the target authenticator is connected here. The second point is the request parameters. In this point, relying parties make requests for authentication results, such as requesting attestation from browser and authenticators. The third point is verification of the authentication result. This verification allows relying parties to check if the authenticator matches their security requirements. We don't have time to introduce all the policies, so we will show 2 typical policies regarding authenticator selection and their implementation in WebAuthn. The first policy would be of particular interest to security-conscious relying parties, such as financial institutions. Relying parties can request to the authenticator to return the authentication result, including the identifier of the authenticator model named AAGUID. In WebAuthn, specify direct in the parameter named attestation conveyance preference. From the returned AAGUID, the relying party can allow only the authenticator that meet its security requirements to be registered. On the other hand, a relying party that only wants to eliminate passwords does not need to perform these verifications. In that case, relying parties can specify none for the parameter named attestation conveyance preference, and the AAGUID will not be returned from authenticator. And please read the paper for more details about the other policies. In conclusion, multiple authenticator is extremely important for FIDO-enabled consumer accounts. We recommended a secure method of registration of multiple authenticator based on FIDO protocol. The typical policy described in the paper are a good starting point for relying parties, but relying parties should augment and customize these policies for their specific needs for users. Well, this brings me to the end of my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Ogami-san. So I have a few questions for both you and Hada-san. And I'm going to introduce some new concepts in here as well, which I think will be of interest to our conversation. So my first question pertains to security levels. So we didn't talk specifically about that in this presentation, but as many know, there are different security levels for FIDO authenticators. My question is, can authenticators of varying security levels be used together as a user's multiple authenticator? So if I can have like an L1 and can I have an L2, does that have any bearing on the advice that you would give to relying parties?
Yes, as long as the authenticators satisfy the security policy of relying party, users can register and use multiple authenticators if they are conformant to the FIDO protocol and the security requirements of the relying parties. In addition, adding multiple authenticators to an authentication system should not degrade the overall security of the system. The overall security of the system depends on the lowest security level. So a relying party should evaluate the authentication level of individual authenticators that are available to their system.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense, and that's a good policy.
Mm-hmm.
So another question about resident credentials. Can you, if you're up for it, explain the difference between resident credentials and non-resident credentials, and how using either one may impact the need to use multiple authenticators for account recovery, especially as we look at platform authenticators?
Okay. The difference between them is that the credential includes the username or not. Using a resident key is very convenient for users because they don't have to type the username. We take an example of managing various types of multiple authenticators, but the above difference is independent of account recovery. Any types of registered authenticators are useful for reducing account recovery needs. Whether a relying party accepts resident keys or not depends on their security policy. If the relying party doesn't specify a parameter called require resident key, then they won't know which credential was generated. We recommend that the parameter be set to true.
Okay. Okay, so my last question, you know, as you noted in the slides, you know, the policies in the paper are a good starting point for RPs, and every relying party has their own business requirements, security policies that need to be customized for their business needs and their users. But I'm curious to get any thoughts on, you know, tactics that relying parties can use to encourage the use of multiple authenticators, you know, without hindering the user experience, without bothering them, especially understanding that the concept of an authenticator is somewhat new. Do you have any suggestions?
Okay, you raised a very interesting point. Relying parties can consider various tactics to encourage users to have multiple authenticators. Relying parties can promote to users the benefit of registering multiple authenticators because different types of them, such as Android, iPhone, smartphones, or Windows, Mac computers, and the security keys are already on the market. For example, relying parties can give a user some rewards if the user registered additional authenticators for backup purpose, as well as one for daily use.
Okay. Very good. Any last thoughts that you'd like to share before we wrap up?
No.
Okay. Well, with that, then, I'd like to thank you very much for taking time today to present on this. For those of you who are watching the webinar, please visit our website and our social media channels to learn more about FIDO and to keep up with our latest activities. So thank you very much, and we'll look forward to engaging with you all on a future FIDO webinar. Thank you.